Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. Since this is an election year, it's time to once again talk about the election, which I'll be doing on and off for the next 8 months. My last program on this subject was back in January, entitled The Evangelical Case for Trump, and that generated a lot of interest and controversy. On this week's program, I'd like to discuss election fraud and look at the question, will they cheat in 2024? And with this program, I may get thrown off of YouTube again for even questioning the integrity of the election process. I believe YouTube took down about 4 or 5 of my programs that I did about the 2020 election. And I was almost permanently banned merely for discussing legitimate reports of election fraud. What YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Google and other social media outlets did in banning the questioning of the election was an egregious crime against the American people. They should be ashamed of themselves. After YouTube took down my final election video, I believe it was my 3rd strike and my whole channel was about to be taken down. Here's what I wrote in an appeal. Quote, "In this video, I never claimed election fraud changed the outcome, hence it shouldn't be removed. One point I made in the video was that YouTube took down my videos last year, not for claiming election fraud, but for simply reporting on evidence people put forth of fraud and historic photos of January 6th, claims and footage that even CNN and the New York Times reported. My point in my video was the importance of free speech and the democracy and the dangerous precedent of not allowing the public to hear both sides or to investigate, as in the case of J6 videos being edited selectively by both the right and the left. If you remove this video, it's not because of any claims of election fraud, it's because you disagree with the video that teaches the philosophy of free, unbiased, impartial speech. Please specify any claims made that the election was stolen." YouTube responded, "After taking another look, we can confirm that your content does not violate our community guidelines." So my guess is that YouTube has software that looks for words such as election and fraud. Then it's flagged and some content moderator gives it a strike if he doesn't like the tone of the video. Well, in this case, I dodged a bullet. But the good news is that because of this, I was motivated to reproduce my channel on Rumble. Because if YouTube does take down my 296 videos, that's going to be a nightmare to upload to some other platform. Anyway, these media companies did a great disservice to our country by banning any questioning of the election results. I mean, what happens if someday there is actually provable election fraud? Are they going to ban any reporting on that? And what becomes the criteria for determining when there has been or hasn't been election fraud? Is it just what the White House says? Or what the deep state says? Or just what one political party says? You can see the problem in that. I mean, what happens if the Republicans cheat? We know that all of these social media CEOs are Democrats, and partisan bias was clearly involved in their decisions. They didn't want anyone to question their man winning the presidency. After the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton and the Democrats filled social media with the crackpot conspiracy theory that Trump won because of Russian election interference. Social media companies didn't ban those conspiracy theories, those election deniers. Also back in 2020, those questioning the election posed no threat to American democracy. In fact, they were helping democracy. We want a public that's constantly investigating and reporting on election fraud. The reporting of the public is supposed to be the fourth branch of government. a watchdog, to put corrupt politicians on notice that they're being watched. But if the media is covering the backs of the politicians, there's no end to what corrupt politicians will do. You know this, and I'm not telling you anything new. So these media companies have set a precedent that elections cannot be questioned. And that's terrible for America, because even Democrats know that someday someone is going to get into these computerized voting systems and move the numbers around. It's not only totally possible, it has already been verified as having happened in multiple states. So it's not if there's going to be massive election fraud, it's only a matter of when. The Heritage Foundation has been compiling proven cases of election fraud. They now have 1,500 cases and 1,276 criminal convictions. And what if someday it's actually discovered that Trump won the 2020 election? I'm sure these social media companies haven't even entertained that possibility. But don't be so sure that the case is closed. Proverbs chapter 25, verse 8, do not go out hastily to argue your case. Otherwise, what will you do in the end when your neighbor humiliates you? My argument after the 2020 election was that if there was a degree of fraud that was being reported, eventually it would come out. Oh, it might take 5 or 10 years, but someday someone would squeal. Luke chapter 12, Jesus said, but there is nothing covered up that will not be revealed, and hidden that will not be known. Accordingly, whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in the light, and whatever you have whispered in the inner rooms will be proclaimed upon the housetops. There are multiple applications to that principle, but in regard to elections, a political party cannot coordinate this degree of fraud without some insider eventually blowing the whistle. If the big lie, as the Democrats call it, wasn't Republican claims of election fraud, but their own claims of election integrity, it's going to be exposed, and there's going to be vindication. In fact, we saw a number of examples of this a couple years ago. In January of 2022, headlines: Georgia investigators have ballot trafficker who is talking amidst being paid thousands in the 2020 election ballot box ballot harvesting scheme. I checked this out from multiple sources, and it's real. A man in Georgia came forward and admitted that he was paid $10 for every ballot put into the ballot box. He made $45,000 in 2 months. Not only this man, but many others. And this was confirmed in tracking cell phone locations in Georgia in the documentary 2,000 Mules. And in this recent report from an Arizona investigation, quote, cell phone data there also indicated that a group of ballot traffickers visited drop boxes in 2 of the state's largest counties no less than 5,700 times during the 2020 election. In the upcoming 2024 election, I'm sure these ballot harvesters have seen all this, and this time they're not going to be carrying their cell phones. But the evidence suggests that someone is spending millions of dollars on these couriers to make sure the Democrats won in the election. Now, if this man alone was paid $45,000 at $10 a vote, that's 4,500 votes. Trump lost in Georgia by just 10,000. Now, the interesting part of this story is that this man's mother told him that what he was doing was wrong, and he needed to come forward and confess. And that's my point. In the future, a few of these bad actors will have a guilty conscience, and some will even have religious conversion and confess their crime. Remember the story of that trucker in Pennsylvania with all of those questionable ballots he was shipping to Harrisburg and then on to Philadelphia? If that was a truckload of illegal ballots to be processed, someday someone's going to confess. Furthermore, currently, the media is burying stories of election fraud, but I guarantee you that someday, when they don't have to defend their man in office, they're going to begin to report on the fraud. So here's a prediction. If the 2020 election was truly stolen by election fraud, someday we will see reported in the New York Times that investigators now believe there was significant election fraud in the 2020 election. And social media companies will tacitly apologize for being wrong. You say that will never happen. But just wait 10 or 20 years when political winds begin to change. We are now at the 4-year anniversary of the COVID outbreak. And look at how attitudes toward COVID have changed. I also had many of my YouTube programs about COVID removed by Google. But now there's vindication for those who questioned the COVID response and the vaccines. And in the mind of the majority of the public, the questioners are now the heroes, not Anthony Fauci and his disciples. Even the state of New Jersey just published a 900-page report on the state's failed reaction to COVID. And there are many other reports out there detailing how the government shouldn't have closed down the schools, shouldn't have closed down the businesses, shouldn't have sent people checks in the mail. The masks didn't work. The social distancing didn't work. The vaccines didn't work. This was exactly what conservatives were saying the whole time. But there was big pharma and COVID hysteria. Well, my point is this. In the same way, there has been vindication concerning COVID-19. I believe there's eventually going to be vindication in regard to the 2020 election. I believe there's even going to be some vindication in regard to January 6th. Those protesters may actually go down in history as heroes defending the republic. That is, once the media doesn't care about the issue any longer, when there's no longer any political advantage, or when their own political party begins to riot, then they'll change their tune. I say this because we've seen this happen so many times over the last 50 years. But in all this, I'm digressing. What about the 2024 election? The great concern on everyone's mind is that if election fraud was possible in 2020, it's possible in 2024. If they cheated once, they can do it again. And the media has already set up a culture of silencing and shaming those they label election deniers. Let's say some activist does tamper with the 2024 vote totals, who can oppose the election results without being immediately discredited. For a number of reasons, election fraud is the perfect crime. It's a crime that's almost impossible to catch and prosecute. So let me list some reasons for you to think about. First, elections are anonymous in America for good reason, but that alone makes discovering and prosecuting election fraud very, very difficult. It's even illegal for investigators to compare voter rolls with U.S. citizenship rolls. And the states themselves do not check with the federal government the citizenship of registered voters. Again, making cheating in elections very easy. There was a big controversy over this whole issue when Trump said a while back that states do not check citizenship status. And leftist fact checkers claimed that he was wrong, but he was right. And when Arizona passed a law requiring proof of citizenship, guess what? The Biden Justice Department sued Arizona over that law. Why? That makes no sense. Well, it looks like the left doesn't want citizen verification or ID for voting. They want complete anonymity, and that favors fraud. Number two, the sheer number of ballots are unmanageable. What, you're going to follow up on every single possible case of fraud? Even if an investigator takes a sample and finds 1,000 illegal ballots, the opposition will still say it's not enough. It's not proven in a court of law. One would have to find and prosecute every single illegal voter before the opposition would have to admit a stolen election. It's almost impossible for evidence of election fraud to reach the standard of beyond a shadow of a reasonable doubt. The only thing one could hope for is for a preponderance of evidence, but in a criminal case, that's never enough to convict. Back in 2020, in Georgia and in Arizona, it was proven that the number of votes with illegal addresses exceeded the vote difference between Trump and Biden. But there was no way of knowing for sure who those votes favored. Those illegal addresses should have called for a second election, but no judge or legislator was willing to touch this. And again, this makes for voter fraud being the perfect crime. Cheaters rarely get caught, and there's not the political will to prosecute. Number 3, election fraud is the perfect crime because politicians have plausible deniability. Party activists at the grassroots can commit voter fraud, and politicians can claim that they didn't sanction it, they didn't pay for it, they knew nothing about it. So politicians have nothing to fear if their activists engage in some fraud. In fact, politicians only have something to gain from fraud. There are no negative repercussions for them. Number 4, with computers, numbers can be moved around and nobody can trace the culprit. Maybe some lower level data entry person might get caught, but not the real hackers at the top. Look how much hacking is going on today, and they can't find the criminals. Here's a story from January of this year. University of Michigan professor Dr. Alex Halderman stood in front of a federal judge overseeing the 7-year-long Curling versus Raffensperger case in Atlanta. And he showed the judge how he was able to easily gain superuser access to a Dominion ballot marking device. Halderman was also able to use a smart card purchased for $10 online and a $20 USB smart card reader from Amazon to program voter cards that could be used over and over again countrywide. He also made a poll worker card and, most importantly, a technician card that would also grant super user access. We learned that commands to manipulate the Dominion ballot marking device could be automated. Simply insert the card and it will do the rest. Furthermore, nothing was needed that wasn't public information to complete the programming. These cards would require some expertise to program, but once the counterfeit cards are made, anyone can insert it into the machine and exploit the vulnerabilities automatically, unquote. So we all know this. Once votes are inside a computer, they're simply switches on silicon substrate, and they can be manipulated. That's why experts in the field are saying that the only secure way to conduct an election is with old-fashioned paper ballots. Computerized elections are an invitation for deep state operators to manipulate the vote while making the public think their vote counts. Number 5, election fraud is the perfect crime because to investigate it, to prove it, to prosecute it takes millions of dollars, millions of hours of time. And very few people have those resources, and the cheaters know that. Bill Barr, the U.S. Attorney General, said about the 2020 election that he had uncovered no evidence of widespread voter fraud that could change the outcome of the 2020 election. Well, of course, because the State Department didn't do a thorough investigation. It would take years to investigate the claims. And Bill Barr engaged in No serious investigation state by state. He didn't have the political will to do so. And we also know the famous statement made by the head of the Homeland Security Cyber Department that this was the safest election in American history. But there was no serious investigation conducted concerning mail-in ballots and local voting machines. This official was just simply trusting the voting system in place. Number 6, cheaters can have the public and the media on their side. Even if there is lawlessness, the vote totals can still be depicted as legitimate votes from legitimate voters, and that every vote should count. And bad actors are emboldened because they know the media and the Democrat Party, which includes at least half the public and many judges and lawyers and police, have their back. Finally, a 7th reason why election fraud is the perfect crime. There can be no independent verification of the vote. The state does the counting, and the state tells you the results. What would make sense is for every voter to be given a special receipt indicating how they voted. So if necessary, the public itself could collect those receipts and challenge the state results. Imagine if in a county, it goes for a certain presidential candidate, and then the losing party can actually show by collecting receipts that they had more votes cast than what was reported. But don't hold your breath. That will never happen. We're supposed to trust the state. Americans have lost faith in the election system, and for good reason. The Democrats or the Republicans could cheat in the 2024 election, and there's practically nothing anyone can do to stop it, short of spending millions of dollars, hiring hundreds of people, and spending thousands of hours. And the police and the FBI are not proactive in uncovering election fraud. It has to be citizen-driven. And election fraud isn't just about cheating in the voting booth. There are other types of election fraud that are just as evil. Let me count the ways. Conservative pundits were not willing to be canceled for claiming that the cheating was in the vote tally, did claim that the cheating was in the media cover-up of the Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's involvement in payments from China. That's a proven fact. But is that cheating, or is that simply politicking, where you support your candidate by only saying good things about your candidate and burying any bad news? And we have the free speech to do that. What about creating false impressions in the media? Is that voter fraud? Here's an article from PJ Media, how the left has created an organization called News Guards that is going to go after the advertisers of any media company that reports election fraud they disagree with. What about using the justice system to prosecute your opponent with trumped-up charges? Is that a form of cheating? Or gerrymandering a district to favor your party? Or installing drop boxes around the city to make illegal ballot harvesting easier? Or instituting early voting? Or accepting ballots after Election Day? Or pushing for no voter ID? Here's a tweet in regard to Tucker Carlson's program. Tucker Carlson, quote, "They're going to steal the election. Joe Biden can't win in a fair election." So what does that tell you? Well, they're going to steal the election. And we know they're going to steal the election because they are now saying so out loud. The chief law enforcement officer of the United States government, Merrick Garland, is telling you that it's immoral, it's in fact racist, it's in fact illegal to ask people for their IDs when they vote to verify. They are who they say they are. So why would Merrick Garland say such a thing? Minorities have IDs. Well, maybe fraud favors his party. Or what about open borders? So that long-term you have more voters for your party. Is that election fraud? Or how about Biden canceling $1.2 billion in student debt to buy votes? Or if a politician lies in his campaign, is that election fraud? Like Obama when he said he was opposed to homosexual marriage, when he really wasn't? What if a candidate lies his way to the White House, even though the vote is true? Actually, evil politicians will use all of these Machiavellian means to get into office: campaign lies, buying votes, prosecuting their opponents, manipulating the media, and finally actually stuffing ballot boxes. There are many things that are legal as far as the FEC is concerned, but illegal and cheating in God's eyes. Were there any examples of election fraud in the Bible? Absolutely. Even though there was no democracy, bad people would still do evil to get into power, to keep power, to gain favor with the rich and the powerful. Judges chapter 9, Abimelech, one of the sons of Gideon, hired assassins to kill all of his brothers so that he would be the sole heir to the throne. 2 Samuel 15, David had a son Absalom, who sat at the gate of Jerusalem and told everyone who had a legal case that he would give them justice, the kind of justice that his father wouldn't give them. And by this, he stole the hearts of the Israelites away from King David. He then formed a coup and took over Jerusalem. Absalom gained power by being a conniving liar, and God judged him. 2 Kings 11, when King Ahaziah died, his mother, Queen Athaliah, assassinated all of the royal heir and made herself queen. In Jesus' day, when the political leaders of Israel, the Pharisees and the high priest, wanted to get rid of their opposition, Jesus, the Gospels say that they feared the people, so they would arrest Jesus at night and have his trial at night when nobody was looking. They maintained their power by working under the cover of darkness. Now, in regard to election fraud, like any criminal investigation, investigators look for means and a motive. In this program, I believe I've shown that the means is there. Elections are not as secure as most people think. If you really want to cheat, there are multiple ways to do that. But there is also the motive. And here we have to have a biblical worldview of human sin to understand and appreciate the motive of cheating in an election. If one is naive and thinks that people are basically good, one will trust the elections to their own destruction. Romans chapter 3, the assessment of mankind. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of snakes is under their lips. Psalm 116:11, all men are liars. Psalm chapter 5, verse 9, there's nothing reliable in what they say. Their inward part is destruction itself. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with the tongue. The truth I really want to emphasize in this program is that we need to assume that there is cheating. The way we should look at it is, if a political party can cheat, they will cheat. Too many view the situation as, yes, there's the possibility of cheating, but people wouldn't do that. And that's the way the media describes the situation. But no, if people can cheat, just assume that they will cheat. But our election system is not set up with that assumption. It's actually an honor system. Here's an interesting study that just came out from a Rasmussen poll taken by the Heartland Institute. 1 in 5 mail-in voters admitted they cheated in the 2020 election. More than 20% of voters who used mail-in ballots in the 2020 election admitted they participated in at least one form of election fraud. Are we surprised? If you send ballots to people's homes and ask them to be honest in filling them out, there's going to be at least 20% who are dishonest. The state is naive in operating on an honor system. Imagine if the IRS collected taxes that way. That's why employers are required to create W-2 forms. So what did these voters do? They filled out ballots in part or in full on behalf of friends or family members, such as a spouse or a child. Your parent is in a nursing home, so you just fill it out. Or your child is away at college, and so you just fill out their voter form. That's illegal unless you have power of attorney. Also, 17% of those who committed ballot fraud admitted to voting in a state in which they were no longer a resident. Here's an article. A California election was overturned because 4 people voted in a district in which they did not live. Also, the survey found that among all voters, 8% said that a friend, a family member, or an organization, such as a political party, offered to pay or reward them for voting in the 2020 election. So we get this. A lot of people are going to innocently fill out ballots for family members, but I guarantee you, of that 20% of ballot voters who committed fraud, 1 or 2% are going to fill out ballots contrary to the will of the person named on that ballot. Maybe even sending in ballots sent wrongly to their address. And in states like Georgia, with over 1 million absentee ballots, just 1% fraud is enough to change the election results. Here's another story. A woman in Yuma County, Arizona, was prosecuted for collecting early ballots from 4 people, not in her family, and filling them out. She was 66 years old enough to know better. She was a former mayor and a Democrat precinct committee member. So, with all that, it's time to conclude. But what are we to think of all this? You know, it's easy to grow depressed and just throw up your hands and give up. But now, more than ever, we need to be watchdogs. It's times like this that our surveillance is all the more important, all the more needed, and will be all the more fruitful. We have before us a great window of opportunity to change our corrupt election system as evidence of fraud becomes so obvious and so prolific, as people are entrusting the election system until it's made foolproof, which can happen if a few lead states move toward in-person, personal identification, paper ballots. Then other states will have to eventually follow the example, but this will only happen if we're diligent to act as watchmen on the wall. Isaiah chapter 58, verse 1, cry aloud, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet and show my people their transgression. Now, in my next program concerning the election, we need to look at another major concern, the violence that may break out if a party's candidate doesn't win. There is extreme polarization in our country. 2 cannot walk together unless they're agreed. And people are investing everything in politics because the state has become their god. Well, thanks for listening. Stand firm in the truth. And may Jesus Christ reign.